So every year, I look forward to this festival as my excuse and more than gentle nudge to read something or someone new. This year, the festival offered me an opportunity to reconnect with history, read Robert Levine's The Failed Promise, and reconsider what I thought I knew about the years following Lincoln's assassination. Andrew Johnson and Frederick Douglass are often referenced in almost folkloric terms or character sketches, and similarly, the period reduced to just historic sound bites. However, there were far more layers to the story. Political maneuvering, alliances made and broken, rhetorical shenanigans, image making, and changing positions, not unlike the modern political environment. And it's fascinating just how fraught the political environment was that led to the framework for Reconstruction and ultimately the impeachment. In addition to the pleasure of discovering a new book for the festival, it's also a pleasure when we can present a local author, and in this case, a local author who is a distinguished scholar as well. Robert S. Levine is a distinguished university professor of English at the University of Maryland and a past winner of Guggenheim and National Endowment for the Humanities fellowships. He has an extensive list of accomplishments, but if I mention one or two, I might slight the one he is most proud of, so maybe we can get that during Q&A. Professor Levine has been published extensively, and most recently, The Failed Promise, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson was recognized by the Washington Independent Review of Books as one of the best books of 2021. Please help me welcome Robert S. Levine.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, John, and it's really great to be here to talk about Frederick Douglass in the Frederick Douglass Pavilion. And I probably made a dumb mistake. I decided to use a PowerPoint, but what I'm going to do in the talk is basically describe everything that's up there. So if you're way over there and you can't see it, don't worry. And if you want a copy, just email me and I'll email you the PowerPoint. The images are also in the book. So I want to start with the cover of the book, the title of the book, The Failed Promise, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and just say a word about The Failed Promise, because when I first submitted the book to my press, it was titled The Failed Promise of Reconstruction, and my editor thought it's more evocative. So from my point of view, the title speaks to the failed promise of Reconstruction, the kind of promising moment after the Civil War, where it seemed like maybe we could become a multiracial nation with everyone having equal rights. I mean, that's one of the failed promises. Another failed promise for me, kind of a surprise in the book, is Andrew Johnson, who we think of as one of the worst presidents ever. But what's really interesting about Johnson is that he was a pro-union, anti-secession Southern senator, the only one of his kind, and he also came out against slavery before the end of the Civil War. So he was unusual. He held some promise. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. And in the title, Frederick Douglass is really key, because I've read around the Reconstruction history. Frederick Douglass is there, but usually as local color. Like, you hear something brief and then you move on. And what I wanted to do was tell a story about Reconstruction, the early years of Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson, from the point of view of Frederick Douglass and other African Americans. And I think it provides a different way of thinking about what was going on. And when I first got the invitation to speak here, I was asked to say something in my talk about why I wrote the book. And in a way, it comes across in the title itself, but I just want to say a few more things about that. That I've been working on Frederick Douglass since the 1990s. I've tended to emphasize the pre-Civil War Douglass. I really wanted to learn more about the post-Civil War Douglass. That's number one. Number two, I started work on this during the Trump administration, and like a lot of people, I got really interested in impeachment. And I wanted more of a prehistory of impeachment to understand that. And as I've already said, I wanted to develop more of an African-American perspective on Reconstruction. And I got interested in voting rights as an issue. And I'm going to talk more about that too. So I don't know if this is going to work. It works, but most of you can't see it. So I'm going to just talk through the slides. So don't worry about the slides, because I'm going to either read them or describe them. So this is my first trade book. And it was really fun. I do edit school books, college books for Norton, but this is the first time I tried to actually tell a story. And I worked with a really good editor who said the real important thing you need to do is tell a story. And when I submitted the manuscript near the beginning of the pandemic, it took 3 months to come back to me. And after 3 months, she had edited 10 pages and basically said, you're not telling a story. Here's how you could do it in these 10 pages. Do you want me to edit the next 300 pages or you? And I thought, well, I'm home because of the pandemic. I'll do it. So that was the fun of writing the book, getting away from deductive analysis and letting things unfold. And anytime I anticipated things, she'd say, stop, let it unfold, draw the reader in. So the story I tell is on this slide, but I'm going to say something about it. I think it's a real story about Douglass and Andrew Johnson. So March 4th, 1865, they meet for the first time. It's from a distance at Lincoln's second inauguration. And around 6 weeks later, Johnson becomes the 17th president of the United States. September 29th, 1865, we're still in 1865, Douglass gives his first, most vitriolic anti-Johnson speech and starts to establish himself as someone who is speaking out against Johnson. February 7th, 1866, Douglass visits Johnson in the White House with a black delegation in which they ask him to bring about black rights. And this is my favorite chapter of the book, and I'm going to describe the chapter more in a second. And obviously I'm going to do a lot in a second. Summer of 1867, Douglass is giving anti-Johnson speeches, a really great speech called Sources of Danger to the Republic. Oddly, surprisingly, Andrew Johnson makes a job offer to Frederick Douglass. Johnson is hearing about these speeches. He wants to get this guy out under his control. He wants him to be shut up. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. And then February 1868 to May 1868 is the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. And Douglass does not attend, but his son Charles does, and that's really significant. So that's the outline of the story. There's actually 4 years that I could follow. And I'm going to highlight just a few aspects of the story, starting with March 4th, 1865, which is the day of Lincoln's second inauguration. So if you can see the PowerPoint, this is a famous picture of Lincoln giving his "with malice toward none" speech. I have friends who are historians, and they tell me, I'm in an English department, they tell me that Douglass is in the second row. Who's going to distrust a historian? So Douglass is there in the second row. And the reason Douglass is there is that Douglass and Lincoln met twice during the Civil War. They seem to have become friends of sorts. And Lincoln invited Douglass to attend the second inauguration, not just the speech, but the reception afterwards. And what happened is that Douglass tries to get into the White House for the reception. Unsurprisingly, he stopped at the door because they weren't expecting to see a black man walk into the White House. And he finally is able to get in, and Lincoln sees him and goes over to him, according to Douglass, and says, "What'd you think of my speech?" And Douglass says, "One of the great speeches." And Lincoln says, "This means so much. This means so much to me." And he tells everyone, "This is my friend." And then he walks over across the hall to Andrew Johnson. And what Douglass says happens next is that Lincoln pointed to Frederick Douglass. So I'm not sure if you can call that a meeting, but if you want to tell a story, yeah, that's a meeting. So he points to Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass writes about this moment in his 1881 Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And it should be up there, but just listen. This is what Douglass wrote. "I was standing in the crowd when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. I turned to Mrs. Dorsey," that's Douglass's black friend, "and said, 'Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race.'" And what I ask in the book is, did he really say this? Is there any reason really for him to have said this? He's writing this 15 years after the fact, and in fact, a lot of people at the time thought that Johnson wasn't that bad. So maybe Douglass said that, maybe not. And I have a previous book of Frederick Douglass which I talk about the different things he says about the same events in his different autobiographies. So I think of him as literary. You know, I'm not saying he's lying. He's literary. He places emphases on what he thinks is important. So I start the book with this scene, and then I step back, and I try to be cinematic. Okay, who is Johnson and who is Douglass? A lot of you know who Douglass is. I wanted to explore who Johnson was. And what I found is that he was an up-from-the-bootstraps guy in Tennessee who eventually became senator in 1857. And when the war broke out in 1860, he was opposed to Southern secession. And Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee. And a year after that, he came out and said, I'm opposed to slavery. And he was shot at. I mean, why would you think this person is someone to be distrusted? So I then, in the book, I point to a key scene from, about half year earlier when Johnson has been made vice president, nominee of a so-called Union party. So it's going to be Lincoln and Johnson. Johnson is still in Tennessee, he's military governor, and he decides in October 1864 that he's going to free all of the enslaved people in Tennessee, which he had no legal right to do. But he just decided he would do it, and he gives a big speech in Nashville. There's hundreds of African Americans there. This came to be known as his Moses of Colored Men speech. And again, if you can see the PowerPoint, and I don't know what's up there, but don't worry about it. You can see some of the things I'm going to be reading or quoting in a minute. So Johnson gives the speech. There's a newspaper account. The newspaper account goes viral, which is a phrase I've heard earlier today. And everyone thinks that Johnson's great. And this account is actually written up in The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery paper, saying, you know, this guy is great. So what you can see, if you can read the quote and otherwise just listen, Johnson declares that the enslaved people are free, and then he says that in due time your leader will come forth, your Moses will be revealed to you. And what happens, according to the reporter on the scene, is that the black people there kept saying, you are our Moses, you are our Moses. So it's a kind of a call and response moment. And then Johnson's response is, well then, humble and unworthy as I am, if no better shall be found, I shall indeed be your Moses and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace. And I'll just say this becomes a leitmotif of his career and of my book. Every time Johnson comes under criticism for being racist, for not doing this or that to help black people, he would say, I am your Moses. You said I'm your Moses. Black people said that I'm your Moses. And he does this up to about 1870. So kind of weird, of course. Okay, so he's the Moses of the colored people. That's what he thinks of himself of. And so he takes office April 15th, 1865, after the assassination of Lincoln. As I show in the book, there are a number of radical Republicans who are happy that Lincoln was dead and Johnson was in power. A big surprise to me. But again, he was seen as progressive, and Lincoln was seen as maybe too pragmatic, moving too slowly. So that's the initial impression of Johnson, that he's actually going to be a good guy. Meanwhile, and again, I'm not sure what's up on the screen, Douglass is arguing again and again, this is after the Civil War, but it was even during the Civil War, and here's a quote from 1865, quote, slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. That becomes his obsession, black suffrage. That for him is the key marker, the key indicator of black equality. And so as I indicated in the book, Johnson very quickly revealed himself as a Southern sympathizer who wanted to admit the ex-Confederate states and then let them decide if blacks can have the right to vote or not. And late April, he issues an amnesty proclamation where he's basically saying, you know, you can all come back. And he champions during this period what historians call presidential restoration. So the idea, his job is just get the states back in the Union, and he argues that in fact they never left the Union because it was illegal. It's not allowed by the Constitution. Therefore, they could not have left the Union, which is a crazy argument. Brenda Wineapple, who has a very nice book on impeachment, says by that logic, murder cannot happen because it's illegal. And the radical Republicans were arguing for Reconstruction. And here's two of the leading radical Republicans, if I'm on sync with my slides. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, but Thaddeus Stevens basically argued that the North won the war, and when you win a war, you can occupy the conquered territory, and you can get them to do what you want. And so he's arguing for a lot of things, but one of the things that Douglass really likes is he's arguing for blacks' right to vote, and that's what Sumner is arguing for as well. Sumner and Stevens were kind of working in back rooms, trying to get Johnson to do what they want, and they didn't publicly criticize him until late 1865. In the fall of 1865, Frederick Douglass refers to the imbecility, and that's a quote, of President Johnson. And he becomes really aggressive going after Johnson. He also starts to think that the radical Republicans aren't radical enough. They aren't doing enough. And he proposes late 1865 at a black conference, black convention, that a small group of black people should go to Washington, D.C. They should act as lobbyists, arguing for the vote for black people, and they should make a visit to Andrew Johnson. And so in February, they actually are able to make this visit. And let me just show you a few slides that you can't see, but I'll show them anyway. And I don't know if you're with me, but George Downing, if you can see that slide, was one of the leaders of this group, and he was a friend of Charles Sumner. He was a black activist. He also was the person who was running the congressional cafeteria. Lewis Henry Douglass was there, Douglass's eldest son, and one of the things I want to emphasize about the book is I don't only look at Douglass. I look at a number of African Americans. I wanted not to just do this kind of hero worshiping. But there's a lot in there about Douglass. So they meet with Johnson. Johnson, as I show in the book, in 1865, met a number of times with black groups. He thought it was good publicity. It showed that he was the Moses of black people. So he agrees to this meeting. One of the interesting things he does is he hires a professional stenographer named James Clephane, who had pioneered a new form of shorthand. What that meant is every word that's said back and forth was captured by this guy. He's very, very skillful, and it all ended up in Washington newspapers that night, and then it was reprinted in Washington newspapers the next day, and then it was everywhere. And I'll resist saying go viral. But I found accounts in California newspapers. I mean, that's how widely known this was. So what I want to say in short is this was a disaster for Andrew Johnson, this meeting. And so here's just some snippets from the newspaper transcript. And again, I'm just going to read, and don't worry if I'm off sync or whatever. But what happens is the delegation, about 8 people, comes into this room in the White House, and Andrew Johnson says, I'm just going to talk to you. And Douglass in his autobiography says he talked for 2 hours. And I don't believe that for a minute because we have the transcript. But he was talking, then he was interrupted a little bit, and he got a little bit angry. And what he said was, and that's up there, but I'm going to read it, I have said, and I will repeat here, that if the colored man in the United States could find no other Moses or any Moses that would be more able and efficient than myself, I would be his Moses. And you see this over and over. I would be his Moses to lead him from bondage to freedom. That comment seems to end the discussion. The group is leaving. Frederick Douglass is at the door. he turns around, and this is all captured by this transcript by James Clephane, and he says, if the president will allow me, I would like to say one or two words. You enfranchise your enemies and disenfranchise your friends. In other words, Johnson was helping the ex-Confederates, who were once his enemies, while scorning the blacks, his friends, who had fought in the Union Army. This accusation infuriated Johnson, and there's a real spirited back and forth now just between Johnson and Frederick Douglass. And finally, things come to an end, and as I said, this black delegation left, and Johnson meets with his aides. And one of those aides wrote a letter about exactly what he said in response to this meeting. He sent the letter to a newspaper editor. The newspaper editor liked Andrew Johnson and decided not to print it. But it survives. And this is what, and this is what Johnson said, quote, "Those damned sons of bitches thought they had me in a trap. I know that damned Douglass. He's just like any," and then he uses the N-word, "and he would soon cut a white man's throat than not," end quote. So he's raging. The black delegation goes back to their boarding house and they craft a response to Johnson that appears in the next day Washington newspaper. So they frame the reprinting of the transcript. They had real media savvy. And Frederick Douglass argues in his autobiography that this particular meeting had a huge impact on how Johnson was viewed, because Johnson got really racist and angry during the meeting itself, including saying blacks should just leave the country. They should just immigrate. And so places that had supported him, like the Christian Recorder, which is a black newspaper, suddenly were editorializing that this is one horrible person that we have in the presidency. So I'm going to try to move quickly now and say that during the spring and summer of 1866, there were massacres of African Americans, over 100 killed in Memphis and New Orleans. Violence that Douglass and others believed was encouraged by Johnson's recurrent racist rhetoric. If you can see this picture, it's kind of a nice picture by Thomas Nast from 1867, a year after the New Orleans massacre, in which we see the kind of iconography that's being used against Johnson. So Johnson is wearing a crown because people started talking about him as King Andrew. And you probably can't read the little writing there, just trust me. Near the top of the shed it says, "I am your Moses." So they're kind of making fun of Johnson's use of that self-conception. Okay, starting in December 1866 and through most of 1867, Douglass delivered various speeches attacking Johnson, including this very harsh speech called Sources of Danger to the Republic, and basically says the problem, the source of danger in the Republic is that the Constitution doesn't keep the president under control. Kind of an interesting argument. And he said this is particularly a problem when, quote, a bad man is president. So it kind of looks forward to our own time. We don't want bad men as presidents. As he's giving the speech, he hears from 3 different people in the White House that Andrew Johnson would like him to be the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau and toss out Oliver Otis Howard. And his son, Charles, urges him to take the job because it paid $3,000, which was a lot. And Douglass turned it down, and the way he turned it down was to write a letter to a newspaper editor in New York saying, you know, I got this job offer, I would never do it. And that letter is introduced by the editor saying the greatest African American in the country would not work for this vile racist man. And the significance here is that Johnson did not want this publicized. The idea was, I'll make this offer through these various people, but I don't want to be embarrassed by you turning me down. Okay, so now we come to the controversy that precipitated the February 1868 impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And what happened, probably a number of you know this, by late 1867, Johnson wanted to fire Edwin M. Stanton, who was Secretary of War under Lincoln and then under Johnson. Johnson thought Stanton was a radical Republican. He just didn't want him there. He made various efforts to get rid of him. No one would fire this person, so Johnson does it himself, and by doing that, he can be impeached. The reason he can be impeached is that the Republicans in March of 1867 passed what's called the Tenure of Office Act, which the Supreme Court ruled many years later was unconstitutional, but basically, I'll just paraphrase what's there. You are not allowed to fire anyone who's been approved by the Senate. The Senate could do that. And if you do that, you have committed a high crime and misdemeanor. All of which is to say that when Johnson fired Stanton, the Republicans were pretty happy because they had a way of impeaching this person. And one of the things I argue in the book is they did not want to impeach him for his racism. They didn't want to impeach him for doing harmful things to black people because most white Americans didn't care. And in the period 1865 to 1867, there were 3 referendums in northern states calling for black suffrage. They all failed. They all failed. This is not in Alabama and Mississippi. This is in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So I read the Tenure of Office Act as a kind of trap that was set by Republicans that allowed them to act. And that isn't really what they cared about, I think. But if you read the impeachment proceedings, which you can find online, and they're only 2,000 pages, you see that over and over, it's just all about legal quibbles connected to the Tenure of Office Act, with a few moments when people actually speak more forthrightly about their problems with Johnson. So on my PowerPoint, if I just go back to that, if those of you can see it, is Edward Stanton there? Oh, okay, then it's actually filed. Yeah, so that's a picture of Stanton. The interesting thing about him is that during the impeachment, he hid out in his office, and food was brought to him. And my theory is that George P. Downing, the black activist who ran the congressional dining room, was bringing him food. He didn't leave the office till this trial was over. And this is a famous picture of the Senate as a court of impeachment that appeared in Harper's Weekly, and it was great theater. But what I've read about it is people say it was boring because you're just going through the Tenure of Office Act. Every now and then, someone like Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts came at Johnson, and then Salmon Chase, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was overseeing this whole thing, would say, "You're out of order. This is about the Tenure of Office Act." Okay, so Douglas decided not to attend. He could have attended. His son, Charles, worked for the Freedmen's Bureau and got tickets. And it seemed like Douglas was going to go. Then he decided not to, and I think he didn't want to distract from the proceedings. Like, here is this great black celebrity. I also think he had no interest in the Tenure of Office Act. So what I found very interesting is there's a whole bunch of letters between Frederick Douglass and his third son, Charles, that are in the Library of Congress collection. And I read those, I worked with those, I thought, these really provide a wonderful insight into their dissatisfaction with the Tenure of Office Act, their dissatisfaction with Salmon Chase and the way that he's running things. And it shows that Douglas was staying abreast of things through his son, who had a job at the Freedmen's Bureau, the bureau that he had urged his father to take that job so you can get the $3,000. So to move quickly, there were votes on 2 of the 11 articles of impeachment in May 1868. Both fell short of conviction by 1 vote. The Republicans decided to end the trial. Since then, there's been debate. What happened? Were people bribed? Was there a concern about Benjamin Wade, who the Republicans didn't like, becoming the next president? He was the next in line, and I'm not sure. So Johnson survives for another few months, and one of the questions that I ask in the book is, would it have mattered if the articles of impeachment had more directly addressed the horrific consequences of Johnson's racist efforts to thwart congressional programs of Reconstruction? Could the Republicans, for example, have impeached Johnson for meddling with and attempting to destroy the Freedmen's Bureau, for returning land to those who had been slave owners, for allowing former Confederates to serve in state governments, for encouraging resistance to just about all measures intended to help black people, and for a rhetoric that may have contributed, as Douglass argued, to the murders of black people in Memphis, New Orleans, and elsewhere? If the answer is that Republicans in a nation in which anti-black racism crossed sectional lines had to make the pragmatic choice of impeaching under the Tenure of Office Act, then my book may have been a little unfair to the Republicans. So again, I'm kind of coming to the end of this presentation, but I want to say a couple more things, and I said 15 minutes, okay. So that means I have like 5 minutes, right? Oh, okay. Johnson survives the trial. He, at the end of his presidency, goes back to Tennessee, and he runs for Congress in 1869. And what I found really odd and surprising is that he ran in black districts, and he carried around news clippings of his Moses of the colored people speech, and he kept showing this to these people who were being newly empowered to vote. In the end, he lost the election, maybe because white people didn't like that he was doing that. But that's how long this kind of fantasy persisted, that he was the Moses of black people. In 1865, he was appointed to the Senate by the Tennessee State Legislature. There were no direct elections yet for senators. He goes back to Washington, D.C., and he dies a few months later. And if you can see this picture, it's a Currier and Ives print of Johnson on his deathbed. He was a former president. People still seem to kind of like this guy. And so this was a very popular print. Meanwhile, I didn't... Okay, so this is a popular print, and now we don't think great things about Johnson, but he actually is pretty popular. Death can do that too, the death of a president. Douglass continued to think that Johnson had been a horribly failed Reconstruction president. This is Douglass in 1880, 5 years after the death of Johnson, and this is from two negatives in the Library of Congress collection. And this is what Douglass had to say about Johnson in 1880. And I'll read this. Andrew Johnson, the Moses of the colored race, had betrayed that race into the blood-stained hands of the old master class. He had betrayed the Republican Party by which he had been elected when he was plotting the organization of a new party upon its ruins, when he was seeking the destruction of the Freedmen's Bureau, when outrage, riot, and murder held sway in the South. So for Douglass, Johnson was no Moses for black people. And one could argue, perhaps incorrectly, perhaps quixotically, that the Republicans' failure to make the case against Johnson in Douglass's terms contributed to the failure of Reconstruction because it allowed Americans to avoid confronting the racial issues at the center of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the nation's longer history. And Reconstruction did fail. By the late 1870s, the voting rights for African Americans secured by the 15th Amendment had effectively been nullified by anti-black violence. It became nearly impossible for blacks to vote in the Jim Crow South until the 1960s, and now we're seeing new restrictions on voting. My book provides a prehistory of what we're facing today in some states, along with a suggestion that if Douglass were alive today, he'd have his work cut out for him. And that work, I'll conclude by saying, would be informed by Douglass's lifelong commitment to American ideals and possibilities. In one of Douglass's most famous late career speeches, the 1894 Lessons of the Hour, He addressed the scourge of black lynching in the country. Everything he had fought for during the Johnson administration seemed to be in jeopardy. But Douglass never gave up hope, and that is one of the many reasons I've loved working on Douglass over the past 30 years. His indomitable spirit of hope, and you probably heard that word in other contexts. Consider the way he concludes a speech that is mainly about horrific violence done to the black body, and this is how I'll also conclude my talk. And these are the closing words of Lessons of the Hour, a lecture about the lynching of black people. Put away your race prejudice, banish the idea that one class must rule over another, recognize the fact that the rights of the humblest citizen are as worthy of protection as those of the highest, and your problems will be solved, and whatever may be in store for it in the future, whether prosperity or adversity, whether it shall have foes without or foes within, whether there shall be peace or war, based upon the eternal principles of truth, justice, and humanity, and with no class having any cause of complaint or grievance, your republic will stand and flourish forever. And I think it's worth reading those words in their entirety. Douglass may have lamented the failed promise of Reconstruction, but in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents, he continued to see promise in the United States for the achievement someday of a multiracial democracy. He dreamed of your republic becoming our republic. His words and deeds continue to inspire. So I'm done. And I'd love to take comments or questions if we have time.
The term Reconstruction, who came up with that term, and what does it mean? What's the history of it?
Yeah, I don't have my OED with me. I'm not exactly sure. That Douglass gave speeches during the Civil War calling for Reconstruction, but not with a capital R. So I'm not sure when that capital R came into being. What I can say is that there was restoration on the one side, presidential restoration on the one side, and congressional reconstruction on the other side. So the presidential restoration is just, Johnson said, get out of my face, Congressman. I'm going to just readmit these states. All they have to do is one thing. The one thing they have to do is acknowledge the 13th Amendment, ending slavery. Then I believe in state rights. They could take it from there. And Thaddeus Stevens, I think, offers the most aggressive take on things in 1865. He probably used the word Reconstruction a number of times in 1865. Maybe he was the leader. Again, his idea was, this is conquered territory. We have a vision for how to reconstruct the South, which involves empowering black people, giving black people equal rights, which I think would also help the Republican Party. I mean, I don't want to say that he's like 100% idealist. And there's a whole bunch of programs that were developed to try to do that, including setting up the Freedmen's Bureau, which Johnson initially liked and then decided he hated. So maybe he wanted to appoint Douglass to the Freedmen's Bureau so you could just end it all and blame Douglass. But yeah, it's a couple of very specific sorts of things where the Northern Republicans want to change how the South is working. Go ahead.
So would this present time possibly be considered a third Reconstruction, with the civil rights movement of the 60s being the second Reconstruction? And if so, how so?
So we have, yeah, you could say this is the first Reconstruction, and I think maybe you could say the civil rights movement is the second Reconstruction, because what we needed was the overturning of Plessy v. Ferguson, which was the separate but equal decision by the Supreme Court in 1896 that basically said you could do anything you want with black people, Southern people in charge. So, I mean, the sad thing is, as I work on this book, is thinking we need a third and a fourth and a fifth Reconstruction, that things still aren't happening. The other terminology that I've seen out there, and probably others of you who are historians, is the idea that there was a first founding and a second founding. And let me see, it was Eric Foner who has a book called The Second Founding that basically argues that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments constituted a second founding. And then you could say what happened is the 13th Amendment, we haven't gone back to literal slavery, but the 14th and 15th Amendments have remained really problematic and troubled. And so that's why we need another Reconstruction. But the idea was that in 1870, you could look at Frederick Douglass's speeches of 1870. In 1870, he's saying, we've made it. We've done everything that I had hoped for because now black people can vote. And then I'd say by 1875, it became almost impossible. And by the late 1870s, virtually impossible. Yeah, so you have the civil rights movement, then you have what's happening today, which doesn't make me happy. Go ahead.
Regarding admission, that you're talking about Johnson and admission, really, Lincoln was very careful during the war to say that the South never left the Union as a rebellion. So when you said Johnson was a dumb statement to say that they never left, that seems to be consistent with Lincoln.
Right. Right. So I think that there are some consistencies between Johnson and Lincoln in the year 1864. And that's when Lincoln was saying something very similar. By 1865, there's a whole book that's devoted to Lincoln's last speech. And that's the speech just before he's assassinated. It's the speech that supposedly John Wilkes Booth attended and thought, I got to kill this guy. This is a speech where he suggests that he might support black suffrage. It's also a speech where he turns against this notion that the South never left. So the thing that people like about Lincoln, he can change, he can develop, he can grow. And Johnson seemed to go in the other direction, that you saw some promise. And then the historian W.E.B. Du Bois says he became pitiable. I mean, that's the word that he uses for Johnson. So when we do counterfactual speculation of what would happen if Lincoln were to become president, the idea would be that he wouldn't hold on to that view that you just mentioned, and that he would be willing to entertain the possibility of blacks voting. And that I think if Lincoln were in office, we probably would not have had the 14th or 15th Amendments as fast as we got them, because they were put together in response to this person that the congressional Republicans hated. And maybe Lincoln would have taken us more gradually to something that wouldn't have led to the South just completely turning against any possibility of Reconstruction. But it's hard to say. But where I agree with you is in 1864, you can see a lot of similarities between the two. The question is about Frederick Douglass and women's right to vote. And it's a complex issue, but what I think is important to emphasize is 1848 is the first women's rights convention in the United States. It's in Seneca Falls. Guess who's there? Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass again and again uses as a motto for his newspapers that everyone, men and women, should be able to vote. In 1870, some of the leaders of the women's movement were really upset with the 15th Amendment and came out with extraordinary racist things. Like, why would you let a black person vote when you have educated white women? Douglass and these leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton had a falling out for a year or two. Then they come back together. And Douglass's last convention that he attended was a women's rights convention, and he comes home and he dies. So, so at 2 minutes, there's a book edited by Philip Foner, who's not the father of Eric Foner, called Frederick Douglass and Women's Rights, and it collects everything that Douglass says about women's rights from the 1840s until the time of his death. And it also collects some of his debates with feminists of the time. And it's really great. You get to see, he's just saying, I want the vote for, men have the right to vote, so men should have the right to vote. And black men are men, so they should have the right to vote. And there was an argument and a kind of break, and then they come back together. And it's kind of a happy ending.
I just want to reiterate, as a historian, what you were just saying. If you go to Rochester, New York, there is a statue near the Susan B. Anthony house of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. They remained friends, but in 1870 they weren't good friends.
Yes.
And I can understand on both sides, because if you look at the debates between them, you see racist rhetoric coming from the women, and from Douglass you see men have to vote, I'm not going to wait. And so they were, they didn't agree in 1870.
Yeah. And I wanted to reiterate as well your endorsement of Eric Foner. He wrote 2 books on Reconstruction. If you want to learn about Reconstruction, you should read Eric Foner.
Right.
Reconstruction had to do with reconstructing the South after the Civil War.
Right.
It's very different what we had in the 1960s and today, because it covers the whole of the United States, not just the South.
Right, yeah. I mean, there are some differences. So I'm in an English department. The other thing I do is I edit the Norton Anthology of American Literature. So I'm, reading poetry, I'm reading short stories. So I read Foner. I figured out who I should read, and Foner is certainly someone you should read.
Thank you.